When the city announced the demolition of St. Luke's Hospital, I knew I had to go back. I worked there for 5 years as a night shift nurse before it shut down. The hospital wasn't the worst place I'd worked, but it was a place that had been neglected for years. Understaffed, outdated equipment, and always on the verge of closure. For most of the time I spent there, I had tried to forget the sense of decay that clung to the walls and the hallways. But there were certain parts of the hospital that no one talked about. The old wing. That section of the building had been closed for as long as I could remember. It had been locked off, no access, no reason given. It was just easier to ignore it, pretend it didn't exist. Most of the staff didn't even know what was behind those walls. But I had a reason for coming back, a reason no one could have guessed. Years ago, I had a patient who disappeared without a trace. He was an old man, quiet, fragile, but not in critical condition. He was just in for some tests, getting his medication adjusted. I was assigned to him, and though he didn't speak much, we had a routine. His condition wasn't life-threatening, but he vanished from his bed one night. No alarms, no one saw a thing. I spent hours that night searching the ward, looking in every corner. It wasn't like him to leave, and yet there was no sign of him anywhere. When I reported it, I was told it was likely he left on his own, maybe wandered off, or someone came to pick him up. But I couldn't believe that. He couldn't even walk without help. I always thought there was something more to it. Years went by and the hospital was finally closed. The building was slated for demolition, and the city gave it the usual treatment. Everything was packed up, sold off, and cleared out. But that old wing was still there, forgotten, like the man I couldn't shake from my mind. I had to know what happened to him. I entered through the side door, the one most people forgot about. It was dark, damp, and the smell of mildew hit me like a punch in the face. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the silence, broken only by the distant sound of my footsteps echoing in the halls. The air felt thick, like it hadn't been touched in years. I walked carefully through the building, past the nurse's station, now abandoned and cluttered with forgotten papers. The place felt as though it were on the edge of falling apart, but I pressed on, heading straight for the old wing. I had to see it for myself. The door to the wing was just as I remembered, locked tight, heavy, as though it had been barricaded to keep something inside. There was no sign of forced entry, though. Someone had broken in before, but it was hard to tell who or how. I pushed the door open with more force than I intended, and it creaked as it gave way. As I stepped inside, a chill ran up my spine. The air in here was different, still, like the place had been frozen in time. Most of the rooms were empty, just rusted bed frames and discarded equipment, but there was a sense of neglect that made it feel alive. I moved further down the hall, shining my flashlight over the dark corners. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, torn papers, dust covering everything like a shroud. It was eerie, almost like the hospital had never really been abandoned, like someone was still holding on to it. And then I reached the room that used to be occupied by my patient. At first it looked like any other, broken windows, dusty sheets, but there was something different, something unsettling. The mattress wasn't completely rotted. It looked as though someone had been using it recently, shifting it around, maybe even sleeping on it. A low noise made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't a loud sound, it was soft, almost like the rustling of fabric or the creak of a chair being moved. I turned off my flashlight, my senses alert, listening intently. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, my breathing slow. The silence in the building was almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then it came again, a shuffle of movement, the sound of something scraping against the floor. I tensed, my instincts kicking in. I wasn't alone. A shadow appeared in the doorway. At first I thought I was imagining it. But then he stepped in. The man was dirty, his clothes ragged and layered, as though he had been wearing them for weeks. His face was obscured by a thick beard, his hair matted and wild. But it wasn't his appearance that made me freeze. It was his eyes. They locked onto me, sharp and focused, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I recognized him instantly. He had been one of my patients. A schizophrenic man, admitted several times over the years, always in and out of treatment. I didn't remember his name, but I remembered his face. He was a quiet patient, often sitting alone in the common area, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. I had always kept an eye on him, but when he was discharged, I figured he'd moved on to a better place. Apparently he hadn't. His voice broke the silence. "You used to work here." My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. He stepped closer. His eyes never left mine. "You were my nurse." There was no malice in his voice, no anger, just a strange, detached calm. "I remember you." The words hit me like a wave. He had been here for a while. He had lived here. He walked deeper into the room, his fingers tracing the edge of the old bed frame as if it were something he was familiar with. "I knew I'd see you again," he muttered, almost to himself. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the forgotten corners of the space. They shut it down, locked the doors, but I came back. He paused, his face blank, as though the words were just facts he had accepted. "It feels safer here, like it's where I'm meant to be." There it was, the sense of delusion, the signs of his illness creeping back into his voice. "I belong here," he said. He wasn't just here because he needed shelter. He had come back because he thought the hospital was where he was meant to be, where he felt safe. The sense of stability he had lost in his mind was locked up in the walls of St. Luke's, in the rooms that had been abandoned and left to rot. My mind raced, my thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. I wasn't sure how to handle this, how to react. He wasn't dangerous, not in the way most people would think, but there was something deeply unsettling about his attachment to the place. "Why did you come back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I never left." I slowly backed away, the chill from the room crawling under my skin. I could feel his gaze still on me, heavy and unblinking. "I have to go," I said, more to myself than to him. I turned and walked toward the door. His voice stopped me. "I'll see you again," he said, almost softly. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. The air outside felt like a breath of relief, but as I looked back at the dark windows of St. Luke's, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. The police never found him. They searched the building, but they couldn't find any sign of life, not even a trace of his presence. I didn't know what had happened to him after that night, but I knew one thing for sure. He wasn't finished with the place, and he had been waiting. "6 years ago, I agreed to clear out an abandoned farmhouse for an old acquaintance. It was supposed to be a quick weekend job, just hauling out furniture, sorting through old belongings, and getting the place ready for sale. I've done similar work before, and most of the time it's just dust, junk, and the occasional odd relic from a life left behind. But this house was different, and even now I wish I'd never set foot inside. The farmhouse was buried deep in the countryside, tucked away behind a narrow, overgrown road. I almost missed the turn. The trees pressed in close on either side, and when I finally pulled up to the property, it was like stepping into a forgotten place, cut off from the rest of the world. The house itself was old, weathered by time and neglect. The windows were covered in grime, and the paint had long since peeled away, exposing gray, splintered wood. Vines crawled up the walls like fingers trying to pull it underground. I grabbed my tools and walked up the porch steps, which groaned under my weight. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else. Something stale. I pushed open the front door, and it swung inward with a slow, reluctant creak. Inside, the house was exactly what I expected. Dust covered everything. The furniture sat untouched, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Family photographs still hung on the walls, their glass frames fogged with age. An old clock stood in the corner, frozen at some forgotten hour. I stepped further inside, the floorboards shifting beneath me. The house had been empty for over a decade, but somehow it didn't feel like it. It didn't feel completely abandoned. I started with the living room, dragging old chairs and tables toward the front door to haul out later. Most of the furniture was too damaged to be worth anything, but I set a few pieces aside that might sell. As I worked, I caught myself pausing every so often, listening. It was probably just the house settling, but every now and then I thought I heard something. A faint noise, somewhere above me, like the shifting of weight. I chalked it up to my own nerves. Old houses make noise, especially ones left to rot. Still, I found myself glancing toward the ceiling more than once. I moved to the shelves next, brushing away dust as I sorted through stacks of yellowed papers and books with crumbling spines. That's when I found the chest. It was tucked into the corner, partially hidden behind a heavy wooden cabinet. The brass latch was rusted, but with some effort, I pried it open. Inside, beneath layers of brittle newspapers, I found a bundle of letters tied together with a thin, fraying string. The name on the envelopes read, Clara Morris. I flipped through them. The paper soft with age, the ink faded, but still legible. Most were from relatives, letters of concern. They spoke of Clara's isolation, her unwillingness to leave the house, her paranoia. One letter, dated just a few months before the house was abandoned, caught my eye. Clara, we've done all we can. You won't let us help you. We can't stay here any longer. The house isn't safe for any of us anymore. I stared at the words. The house isn't safe. I told myself it didn't mean anything, but I couldn't ignore the way my hands felt colder as I held the paper. I worked through the afternoon, clearing out room after room, trying to ignore the feeling that had started to settle in my gut. By the time I made it upstairs, the light outside was fading. The hallway was narrow, floor creaking under each step. The bedroom doors were all open except for one at the very end. It was shut tight. I hesitated before turning the handle. The room inside was small, barely big enough for the narrow bed against the wall and the wooden dresser beside it. But what caught my attention were the deep scratches on the floor, leading toward the bed frame. I crouched down, brushing my fingers over the grooves in the wood. The marks were uneven, erratic, as if something had been dragged across the floor over and over. I stood up quickly, exhaling through my nose. It was nothing, just an old house full of old things. But then I heard it, a noise from the attic, a shuffle, a thump. I turned toward the ceiling. The attic hatch was just above me, the wooden panel sitting slightly askew. A string dangled down, swaying gently. I hadn't noticed that before. For a long moment, I didn't move. The air in the room felt different now, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stepped back into the hallway, keeping my eyes on the attic door as I made my way downstairs. I had no reason to go up there. None. I spent the next hour trying to work, but something had shifted. I couldn't ignore the silence anymore. It felt unnatural, like the house was waiting for something. As I carried another piece of furniture outside, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. A figure. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the overgrown brush. A man. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse in my throat. The yard was empty, the trees stood still, but I knew what I had seen. I dropped everything and locked my truck. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even after I left, my mind kept circling back to the farmhouse, to the attic, to the figure in the trees. A few weeks later, I called Tom. "Did they sell the place yet?" I asked. There was a pause. Then his voice came through the line, slower this time. "The house?" he said. "It's been empty for years. The bank couldn't get anyone to take it. Locals say it's got history. Bad history." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" Tom sighed. "I don't know the details. Just that the last family who lived there up and left one day. No explanation, no forwarding address. Place sat empty ever since." I didn't respond, because I remembered the letter. The house isn't safe. And I remembered the attic. I never went back to that farmhouse. I never asked any more questions. Some things are better left untouched. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. I've always been fascinated by the human mind's ability to deteriorate under isolation. As a psychology major, I spent countless hours studying the effects of solitude on mental health. So when my friend Alex suggested we conduct an experiment in an abandoned asylum, I couldn't resist. The idea was to spend a night in complete isolation, documenting our thoughts and reactions to see how quickly our minds would unravel. The asylum, once a place of healing, now stood as a testament to neglect and decay. Its walls, once painted with vibrant colors, were now chipped and faded, revealing the cold concrete beneath. The windows, like empty eyes, stared back at us as we approached. It was the perfect setting for our experiment. We assembled a team of 5. Alex, our de facto leader, Rachel, a sociology major with a keen eye for human behavior. Jake, a tech whiz who rigged up cameras and microphones to capture every moment. Emily, a philosophy major who was always questioning the nature of reality. And me, documenting everything in my journal. The rules were clear. No phones, no communication with the outside world, and no leaving the premises until dawn. We would be alone, with only our thoughts to keep us company. As we entered the asylum, the air inside was heavy with the scent of mold and decay. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the creaking of old wooden floors beneath our feet. We chose a ward on the second floor, the rooms still lined with rusted hospital beds. It was here that we would spend the night, each of us in our own room, with only the sound of our own breathing for company. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I wrote in my journal, observing the shadows cast by the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The others were similarly occupied, their scribbles and murmurs the only signs of life in the deserted hall. But as night deepened, the atmosphere began to shift. The shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting into menacing forms that lurked just out of sight. I started to wonder if we were truly alone. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I pushed it aside, attributing it to the eerie setting. It was around midnight when I first heard the noise. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard, echoed down the hallway. I stopped writing, my ears straining to pinpoint the source. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I got up, my footsteps echoing as I made my way to the room next door. Rachel was sitting on her bed, her eyes fixed on the wall opposite her. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her gaze never wavering. "It sounds like it's coming from Jake's room." We moved quietly, not wanting to disturb the others. As we approached Jake's room, the scratching grew louder. I pushed open the door, and what I saw made my breath catch. Jake was sitting on his bed, his back to us, his hands moving rapidly over a piece of paper. The scratching sound was coming from his pen, moving in frantic strokes. "Jake, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice low. He didn't respond. Rachel and I exchanged a worried glance. Something was off. Jake was always the calm one, the tech expert who kept us grounded. But now he seemed different. As we watched, Jake's movements became more erratic. The scratching grew louder, more intense, until he suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. "Jake," Rachel said, her voice soft but urgent. He turned to us, his eyes wild, unfocused. "I saw something," he muttered. "In the cameras, a figure. It was watching us." My mind raced with possibilities. Had Jake really seen something, or was this the start of his mental breakdown? We tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. He insisted that we had to leave, that we weren't alone in the asylum. The rest of the night was a blur. Jake's paranoia was contagious, and soon we were all on edge. Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to move of its own accord. As dawn approached, we gathered in the hallway, exhausted and shaken. Jake was still convinced that we had been watched, that something had been waiting for us in the shadows. We decided to review the footage, hoping to find some explanation for Jake's claims. As we packed up our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something. The asylum seemed to loom over us, its empty corridors whispering secrets we couldn't quite hear. Back in the safety of our dorm, we gathered around Jake's laptop to review the footage. The cameras had captured everything, our movements, our conversations, and something else. A figure, fleeting and indistinct, appeared in the corner of one frame. It was there for only a second, but it was unmistakable. We stared at each other, our minds reeling. Had Jake really seen something, or had he manipulated the footage? The question hung in the air, unanswered. As I looked at Jake, I realized that the true horror wasn't the figure in the footage. It was the possibility that one of us had orchestrated this entire experiment to test our sanity. And if that was the case, who was the puppeteer and who were the puppets? The experiment had been designed to push us to the edge of sanity, but it seemed we had crossed a line into something far more sinister. The asylum, once a place of healing, had become a playground for psychological manipulation. And as I closed my journal, I couldn't help but wonder, had we truly been alone in that abandoned asylum, or had we been part of a twisted game all along? The answer, like the shadows in the asylum, remained elusive, waiting to be uncovered.